We take another look at problems associated with working with diverse populations. In particular, in this chapter, our author addresses particular issues related to African Americans in U.S. society, as well as the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered client population. Both of these populations are comprised of individuals that you are certainly going to encounter during the course of your career, and it's going to be very useful for you to be cognizant of some of the basic things that Glicken talks about in this textbook. As I have said in previous lectures, when we're talking about diverse populations, this is just a very superficial sketch of issues, and if you expect that you will be working with significant numbers of this population in particular, I would strongly encourage you to get more information. At a minimum, take a diversity class during the course of your education if one is available. Take more than one if you can. From time to time in your employment, you may find that you have opportunities to take training sessions in diversity, and I encourage you strongly to take those and to take them again and again to help yourself retain sensitivity to the issues that our minority population clients must face. Discrimination is one of these things that we like to convince ourselves no longer exists in the United States, particularly when it comes to racial discrimination. And our President Obama in 2008 actually skirted around much of the issue involving race in his campaign. I believe probably because he had to do that. If he were going to be elected, he had to, sadly, I believe he had to convince the population of the United States that race was not a big issue for him. And so there seemed to me to be a little bit of denial about the existence of the racial problem during his first campaign, in particular when he talked about us being a post-racial society. And we have certainly learned since that time that we're anything but post-racial. We knew it then, I believe. One of the ways that we know that discrimination is alive and well, as this slide points out, is through all the different kinds of hate crimes that we see directed at members of minority populations. The APA describes hate crimes as violent acts against people, property, or organizations because of the group to which they belong or identify with. Fewer than 5% of the offenders are members of organized hate groups, which means that by and large most of the hate crimes that occur in our society actually occur at the hands of individuals, and they seem to feel that it's okay to do so. It's as though that somehow society gives them permission for that. And you can see from the numbers here in this slide that the number of bias-related or hate crimes certainly are pretty numerous in the United States at this time. And that only involves ones that the FBI is aware of. Of course, there are many crimes that go unreported. Ethnic minorities are very often the victims of hate crimes because either they're new to the country or they're seen as being different from us. In many respects, there's a resentment towards immigrant populations because they're seen as sort of interlopers into the job market, and that they're taking jobs away from individuals who are marginally employed in the communities and where they settle, those kinds of things. Ethnic minorities oftentimes are the victims of anti-immigration bias, and they're sort of a double-edged sword with this, because if they don't do well when the minority ethnic population, when they immigrate, if they don't do well, then there's resentment because of the resources that they seem to need to take from us, the taxpayers' resources that could be distributed, they believe, to other people who have lived here all along. If they do succeed, they create resentment because, well, they're taking jobs away from people that that might otherwise be doing better. Some hate crimes are religiously motivated, and they tend to be directed towards either Jewish people or against Muslims. Especially since 9/11, we see more hate crimes involving Muslims, as was addressed in another lecture in this class. apparently, the numbers suggest that the widest form of hate crime really comes against gays and lesbians, who suffer more serious psychological effects from it than they do from other types of criminal injury. And we'll be talking about that later in this particular lecture. There are medical and research reports indicating that the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered community experience high levels of anti-gay harassment, abuse, and violence. SAMHSA, which is a division of the National Institute of Mental Health, says that GLBT youth experience more violence-related behavior at school than do non-GLBT youth, and also that they have higher rates of suicide attempts. The gay and lesbian bisexual community, as kids come out, become at greater risk for suicide because of the even today, which I think has a more accepting attitude towards gay and lesbian youth than it did the school population. At least there's still a significant portion of the population that are very resentful and denigrating of that population. Active homosexual and bisexual adolescents have suicide rates that are higher, 27% higher compared to youth with only heterosexual experiences. And they're also more likely to be threatened with weapons. They're at much greater risk than the general population of youth for major depression, for generalized anxiety disorder, for substance abuse and dependence, suicidal behavior, sexual risk-taking behavior, and in general poor health maintenance behaviors. LGBT youth at times are, when they do come out or they're discovered by their parents, at times are kicked out of the family. They're not allowed to stay in the home any longer, and these kids may wind up on the street and sometimes wind up having to hustle and prostitute themselves in order to exist. So they're really at very high risk for harm, and this is the gay and lesbian youth community, perhaps even more so than the gay and lesbian adult community, are in serious need of social work interventions. There are laws that govern discrimination, and of course the existence of laws doesn't mean that the behavior that the law controls doesn't exist any longer. Of course, we know this anyway, but certainly with the civil rights, that's been very clear to us that Congress may enact legislation and the courts may pass laws that grant certain rights to individuals. That doesn't mean that those individuals actually get rights. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 protects men and women who perform substantially equal work in the same establishment from sex-based age discrimination. The Age Discrimination in Employment protects individuals who are 40 years or older. And the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, also prohibits employment discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities in the private sector as well as in state and federal governments. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities who work in the federal government, and the Civil Rights Act of 1991, among other things, provides monetary damages in case of intentional employment discrimination. And the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission enforces all of these laws, provides oversight and coordination of all federal equal employment opportunity regulation practices and policies. So going backwards here, you see is legislation protecting individuals based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin. You see gender bias protections, you see age protections, you see protections for the disabled. And so there are laws that really govern against discrimination for nearly all of the minority populations. The one population that is missing here, certainly more so than any other population, is sexual orientation. That is not mentioned here, and some local organizations, local governments rather, have enacted legislation protecting against discrimination. Other municipalities such as Anchorage a few years ago, in fact, continues to not offer the same protection about employment. For instance, hiring practices, sexual orientation is not something that is a protected area as far as hiring practices are concerned in Anchorage. It was a vote of the community a few years ago. Sadly, some of the leaders of the community, religious leaders in the community, in fact, came out opposing the passage of that law. So have anti-discrimination laws worked? I think the answer at best is a tepid maybe, or possibly a no. Women were discriminated against in education for a very long time, as this slide points out. A number of laws had to be passed. Some of them have helped women to achieve some equity in the workforce with men, but others have not. Here's a good figure that almost 200,000 more women than men graduated from college in 2003, and they did better academically, yet women still earn much less than men for doing the same work. As I'm sure you know, the figure is somewhere around 77 to 80% of what men make. There have been some recent studies that question this, and I actually heard it reported that women have gained equality with men according to statistics in the workforce earnings, and that's simply not true. What I believe it probably suggested was the particular population they were studying, which was young women graduating from universities and things like that, or women of that certain age where they would be graduating from universities. When they first go out in the workforce, they may be making more collectively or as much collectively as men make. However, as within a few years, their men begin to advance more quickly, make more money. There are probably different reasons for that, including, although it's against the law, gender bias in terms of promotions and things like this, and certainly that can be there. And also because women leaving the job force in order to have children, and sometimes employers, although legally they can never state this, but the fact is, I'm sure that many employers are reluctant to promote or hire women that may be having children because of what it's going to do to the business. Now, we can say all we want to that that's not legal and employers won't do that, but again, remember the law and the practice are two entirely different things, and this is fairly simple for employers to disguise. There you see the disparity in salaries for men and women, and that's really, it says about 75% of what men earn, and I've heard figures a little higher than that recently, but there's still a good deal that needs to be done to bring about gender equality, and let's not kid ourselves that women have achieved gender equality. And I read that and hear that oftentimes in my classes, and read that in discussion boards, that women have made major advances and can now consider themselves equal to men in our society. And please don't let yourself be convinced of that, because it's really quite far from the truth. We have a few more generations to go, I think, before we're going to find gender equality, and really only if we become aware of the fact that we don't have gender equality now. This is still very much a patriarchal society, and this goes on also to include, the inequalities that we have to deal with in terms of not only the women but the disabled, the elderly, the less educated, those who are racial and religious minorities, socially and economically disadvantaged groups. There are inequalities for all of these groups in our society. There was a study that might be of interest to you. You have probably heard this from me if you have taken other classes with me. There's a study, I believe it's available on the web still. If you Google driving while black, you'll see the results of this study, which was conducted in New Jersey Turnpike, I believe, in the last decade or so. And the upshot of the study, which was really a pretty interesting study, the way they went about doing this, they just watched the number of times that black drivers were stopped on a New Jersey Turnpike versus individuals of other races, and found that much disproportionately higher numbers of black drivers were stopped by New Jersey state troopers, and the crime, of course, that's what they say, the crime was driving while black. But African-Americans and Latino patients also suffer diagnoses in the mental health area, that they're often diagnosed as schizophrenic, whereas white patients were oftentimes more correctly diagnosed with less serious emotional problems. And there are studies that suggest that this misdiagnosis is not intentional, but it is a subtle, unintentional racism. And when we talk about discrimination and racism, and the need for diversity training among professionals, is because you and I very likely have elements of racist thought that has a lot to do with how we approach the world. And it certainly, and I would say this to Caucasians, and I think probably to other groups as well, that it is not something we like to look at. It's not something we want to acknowledge, but the likelihood is that there is some leaning towards that, and that goes back to the fact that we were raised by people who were raised by people in a society and in a culture where open racism was entirely acceptable. I'm reading a book now. I told you I was kind of a history geek, I think, and reading a book about the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, and that's about as history geekish as you get. He was president 100 years ago. Very fascinating man. This is a new book. It's a biography, and right now reading about the controversy around segregation in federal agencies during the first couple of years of his administration, and how difficult it was for him. While I think his inclination at first was to segregate work units, he found that politically it was very damaging to do that, and for a number of different reasons actually backed off of some segregation orders that he had issued. And the thing that you need to keep in mind is that during that period of time, the culture was that segregation was necessary. This was 50 years after the end of the Civil War at this point, and there were a lot of people who really were kind of were very upset with what they saw as a movement to lead to the equality of races and things like this. And again, this is in America just 100 years ago. And that seems like a long time ago, I know, but really it isn't that long ago. And so even 100 years ago is just a couple of generations back. And so we are the products of individuals who were children and adults in that area, and in that era rather. And so we will likely carry some of those messages within ourselves that we need to be cautious about as we work with individuals. And that's what Lesloff and Hardy are talking about when they say this unintentional, subtle racism that sometimes enters into the work that we do. Not only that, but you see here that this says that not only were they diagnosed more frequently, but also with severe mental illness, but at the same time they spent less time in the hospital, got less privileges than white patients. They were given more medications, which, really, that sort of implies we're just trying to, treat the surface and not really dealing with what's going on underneath. Less likely to receive therapies like occupational therapy and recreational therapies that might be a help to them in other spheres of their lives. And so there's just a lot of those kinds of things that studies still tell us that we do not have equality even in our own profession. The U.S. Surgeon General indicated, this is very interesting, in fact, that cultural and social influences play important roles in mental health, mental illness, and service use when added to all those other spheres that go into diagnoses and treatment. To understand the barriers to treatment that affect ethnic and racial minorities, the Surgeon General says that the mental health system creates impediments sometimes that leads to distrust and the fear of treatment, and stops racial and ethnic minorities from seeking and receiving needed services. These disparities probably stem from the historical and present-day struggles that minorities face with racism and discrimination. Certainly has an impact on their mental health and employability, which leads to lower economic and social status and lower political status as well. There are one Whaley, one writer, expressed concern that Caucasian clinicians see African Americans as being somewhat paranoid because of their cultural distrust of Caucasians, because of the historical experiences with racism, when those experiences are very real. And this is again another area that's important to keep in mind as we get to know other populations and as we try to become culturally sensitive in working with other populations. is not only the individual experiences of the persons in that minority group, but also understanding the collective experience of the minority group itself, the historical context in which those individuals have been raised. Just like I was saying earlier, that Caucasians today are raised by individuals from just a generation or two removed, where segregation and discrimination was considered acceptable. It wasn't something you even had to hide in American society. Likewise, individuals of the minority groups who were raised by individuals may not be today experiencing as much discrimination as they did 100 years ago. Maybe they are, but nonetheless, their worldview is going to be impacted by the worldview of the individuals who raised them. And so understanding the historical history of the different diverse groups that you encounter in your work is something that's very important in being able to be culturally sensitive in your work. And thus, this is why I say more study than anything this class, this lecture can give you. The ability to be able to look and recognize when problems do or do not revolve around the mere fact of being black can have serious implications for the acceptability of treatment. Sometimes the problems have to do with the African Americans' experience in society. Sometimes it doesn't, and you need to be able to kind of face that question and try to get that question answered, and that might help raise your credibility with your client. Those of us with limited awareness of the significance of race probably going to have difficulty really being empathic with clients and to understand the conflicts that they do have, many of which are related to race, either directly or indirectly. Franklin talks about the individual or the invisible factor of racism, and this is, I guess, one of the things I was just talking about. When I was talking about our own historical roots, the invisible factor of racism, which provides messages from childhood that black males lack value and worth, and that deny black males full access to life's amenities and opportunities. Now, not only do we have those messages from our childhood, but understand oftentimes your African American clients have those same messages themselves. And so if we're not careful, we can go in and continue to sort of exorcise the demons from previous generations. By the same token, you may find your own clients weighted down with a subscription to the stigmas associated with being a racial minority, and that may be something you have to help them see and help them begin to overcome as well. Franklin describes the African American male as having a sense of invisibility, and that he is therefore has a low self-esteem because of these constant messages of his unacceptability. So we as helping professionals should go slowly with black males, he says. Another study by Williams provides, there are 2 slides about this, by the way, that different guidelines for effective work with black men. And some of these are really guidelines that we would practice with any group, minority or otherwise, but in the context of working with a minority group, African American or otherwise, these take on more meaning perhaps. For instance, that black males must be recognized for their many strengths instead of focusing upon the problems that they encounter in our society, and recognizing or kind of seeing black males first as a part of that group, for instance, that's more frequently imprisoned, and those kinds of things, to recognize the strengths in their group as well, and of the individuals. They want to participate in their treatment as partners. Black men are particularly sensitive to the sexist notion that berate or bash men, and they are likely to increase violence. And again, black males experience not only racial discrimination, but sometimes sort of a reverse sexism in a sense, in that there's a certain kind of mistrust of black males and stereotyping of black males that kind of make them be seen as potentially violent individuals, for instance. So we should approach black men with respect, concern, work with the institutions that are significant in the black community, including church and family. Poisson, actually, this is the one with the 2 slides, I'm sorry, also has some guidelines for working with African American clients. The importance of acknowledging sexist behavior. That also includes lack of respect for women and the need for psychological and physical dominance, and acknowledges the reverse sexism of viewing black men as losers. And so he sees here basically that sexist behavior affects both men and women in the African American community. Analyzing attitudes towards interracial romance and understanding that everyone has a right to select his or her own mate. Perhaps less of an issue today, but I have read and my own experience anecdotally suggests, there's those anecdotes again, but it suggests that indeed of all the interracial relationships, the one that seems to trouble individuals the most in the Caucasian culture are blacks and whites. Less of an issue about Hispanic and whites, or Asian and whites, or Native American, Alaskan Native and whites, but when there's a pairing of a African American and a Caucasian, particularly an African American male and a Caucasian female, there just seems to be a lot more concern about that among individuals. The ability to listen to one another and hear mutual concerns about life. Being able to emphasize the positive qualities of African Americans, and looking for African American couples who model positive behaviors that other African Americans might emulate. Treating each other with respect and dignity, the avoidance of using sex and money to manipulate or control partners. These are things that are universal, again, maybe more specifically important for this particular population and other minority populations. Lawson and Sharp proposed guidelines for helping African American men following a divorce, or those with larger emotional problems. And some of the culturally sensitive practices should include things like promoting culturally competent relationships in which the clinician is aware of the discrimination and economic inequities that the black man faces. This is something that's important for us to be aware of and to face and acknowledge in our relationships with our black male clients and black female clients. Develop compassion and awareness for some of the emotional issues that African American men may not openly show but still are felt very deeply. Respect the ambivalence that African American men will feel for the helping process. Encourage alternative approaches to practice that utilize things like spirituality. The church can be a very, very important institution in the black community, family support networks, and so on. African Americans have a stronger sense of kinship than Caucasian families tend to have, and so you'll often find, for instance, children who can't be raised by their parents being raised by their grandparents. That is less prominent in Caucasian families than it is in the African American culture. So you see some other things here that involve culturally sensitive practice, including advocating for social policy changes and legislation that permits changes in the approach to family units in the African American community. There have been historically some concerns expressed by some individuals who have studied African American culture about the lack of a stable male figure in that culture. First of all, I think that is overblown. But secondly, there are those who do acknowledge, if there is an acknowledgement that there is more of a matriarchal structure in many of the homes among the African American community, that does not necessarily mean that it's at all a dysfunctional pattern. Some and again, you're looking at the historical roots of of how we exist today, no matter who we are. There are some studies that really kind of tie, if indeed black males are less present in the lives, statistically speaking, of their families, they can tie that back even to the days of slavery, when black males were taken from their families and sold, as an intentional effort on the part of the slave owners to maintain their own predominance and to limit the power of the male in the family, in the slave family. Very complicated topic, and worth studying, and worth being more aware of. So those are some of the considerations, again, in working with African American families. And again, I would tell you that the same considerations, while they may differ from group to group, we need to be equally sensitive in other populations, including Native American and Alaska Native families, which, again, unfortunately, are not really dealt with in this textbook at all. And we will have one of our diversity groups will be looking at Native American and Alaska Native issues in that particular part of the class, and so you'll have an opportunity to discuss those issues when that paper is put up in discussion forums later in the semester. Finally, just a couple of slides about the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transsexual community. These men and women have an obvious set of traumas that they must deal with throughout their lifespan. And because of that, many of them often suffer severe depression, and because of the lack of acceptance, it really ties back into homophobia, this fear of homosexuals. And because of this, they experience a higher rate of suicide than the population at large. When you're working with LGBT populations, keep in mind that the supports that are there, the approval that is there for heterosexuals just doesn't exist. Now, in this day and age, as there is an apparent wave of change going on across the nation, with more and more states approving same-sex marriages, understand that, again, changes in law will precede changes in attitudes. And while a certain segment of the population, which I think would likely include most all of us in this class, I hope all of us, and certainly the gay and lesbian community, and others, there's a certain group of individuals who are happy and rejoice over this advance in civil rights and human rights in our nation today. But rest assured that there is a very large group that are not happy about that, are not rejoicing about that, who look with disdain upon the notion of same-sex marriages and sexual activity and those kinds of things. Many are tied to religions that many of us subscribe to, in fact, and some of it's not religious based, some of it's strictly based on prejudices and misinformation. But whatever the cause, again, changes in the law will precede changes in attitude for a long time. And so your LGBT clients are going to continue to experience hate crimes and discrimination and prejudices, and this is something you need to be keenly aware of, and don't believe that because something changes in the law that the problem goes away. That just doesn't happen like that. And so always be aware of the fact that this population is going to be at higher risk for emotional problems and things like suicide. This is you could really do a whole semester and more in this particular topic, but that talks here a little bit about the development of identity and suggests this potential for emotional risk. And here's sort of a three-stage process, and I've seen it separated into more stages than this, for same gender identity development. That includes first the definition of self as gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgendered. Next, self-acceptance, where one comes to be comfortable with who they are, or at least acknowledge, if not being comfortable for oneself in who they are, and then disclosure, which once that occurs, then there's all sorts of things that can be set into motion in that person's life, which may be supportive, may not be supportive. Our society, even many of the institutions, do not provide the kind of support that heterosexual individuals get, and so lesbian, gay, bisexual individuals can continue to be the subject of discrimination. They don't have the institutions that celebrate certain things like marriage, for instance, again in many of the states that celebrate marriage, that may celebrate adoption. It is difficult for these individuals sometimes to find acceptance in society, even if they've begun to accept themselves, or they do accept themselves. Homophobia, gay bashing has long and strong negative impact on these individuals, and adolescents in particular are in need of support from their parents, from educational personnel, close family, friends, peers, and other adults in the community. And oftentimes those supports are very thin, very limited, if they exist. There is some hope that families will be able to add to the resilience of lesbian and gay and bisexual youth, because families evolve and may shift positions in an attempt to develop strategies to fight social stigma. I don't know what they're trying to say there. Is I think that families sometimes can, while initially maybe having not a positive response to a disclosure of a lesbian or gay child, for instance, nonetheless can adjust and begin to provide support. And so that's something that perhaps, even with initial strong resistance in a family, we can work with to try to aid our adolescent clients to be able to reconnect and get the necessary support we all need at that age in particular. Denial, ambivalence, outright rejection of sexual identity increases the potential for rejection by family and the community. So even their own acceptance is something that's very critical. So that concludes this particular lecture on this topic, and so if there are any questions remaining from this lecture, please do contact me. Otherwise, thanks very much for listening.